Trial resumed. Jury not present.
The court said, "Good morning."
All counsel said, "Good morning, Your Honor."
The court said, "Please make your appearances."
Mr. Ferguson said, "Good morning, Your Honor." Micah Ferguson and Justin Horton for the United States.
Ms. Schrofa said, "For Mr. Ho-Wan Kwok, Sabrina Schroff and Scott Skirrick. Good morning, Your Honor."
The court said, "Please be seated. Is there anything before we get started at 9:30?
Mr. Ferguson said, "Yes, Your Honor. I think we had 2 points. 1. And I don't want to raise something that the proper defense counsel is not here to respond to, but just to inform the court of an issue. Maybe we can take it up at lunchtime. We've been working very well with the defense on stipulations, translations, and we appreciate their assistance in making this a more efficient trial. There is one recording that we have agreement on with the defense. It was a recording that was part of Mr. Shamal Medrano's, large summary chart of videos that we redacted because we were still working on translations for that video. I think we've reached agreement on the translation of it, Your Honor, and we've reached agreement that, for what actually goes back into evidence. We can use an updated version of Mr. Medrano's chart that includes this video and the translated text. There is one portion of the translated transcript that we have a dispute about. It's not a translation dispute. It's a Rule 403 dispute. And I won't get ahead of it because I want Mr. Kamraju or Mr. Barkin, who I've discussed this with more recently, to be here to address it as well, but just very briefly to preview it. It's about 2 lines of text where Mr. Gwa says something to the effect of, "The United States will never falsely accuse you." Listen to what I say. The United States will never falsely accuse you. The context for this remark is, in 2020, when the investigations into GTV begin, Mr. Gwa is broadcasting that essentially the people who are complaining to the U.S. authorities are in fact fake victims and CCP spies or traitors. And they're going to be criminally charged by the United States. And he makes this remark about how the United States will never falsely accuse you. Our view is, there's nothing unfairly prejudicial about using, an opposing party's statement against legal interests. That's sort of the heartland of what an opposing party admission is. Criminal defendants confess in some instances, and confessions are admissible at trial. And so our view is there's number 403 issue here really, if a statement by the defendant is clearly admissible. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. We can take it up unless the defense wants to take it up now.
The court said, "So we need not hear now because neither of those attorneys are here. But your understanding is that the defense position is that the statement is unfairly prejudicial?"
Mr. Ferguson said, "Yes, Your Honor."
The court said, "Okay. Anything else?"
Mr. Ferguson said, "There was one other matter that Mr. Horton wanted to address, given that we are hopeful, but not certain. We may rest today, and I'll let Mr. Horton address that."
Mr. Horton said, "Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor had indicated one day last week that the court would like the government to make a formal application pursuant to Hay for the admission of co-conspirator statements that came in at trial. So I just want to address that briefly. In 6 weeks of testimony, give or take."
The court said, "So is this what you're offering at this time?"
Mr. Horton said, "If the court wishes, I'm happy to make that application now."
The court said, "Go right ahead."
Mr. Horton said, "So we've had something like 6 weeks of testimony and documentary evidence at trial about a sprawling, interconnected series of racketeering and fraud conspiracies that were global in nature, extensive in time, and really depended on communication as sort of their fuel and lifeblood. And there's been a considerable amount of co-conspirator statements and documents reflecting those statements offered into evidence subject to connection under the circuit's Hay protocol. I'll just start with the top and say that the standard, of course, is a preponderance. So the court needs only find that it's more likely than not that these declarants were members of conspiracies with the defendant, and spoke during and in furtherance of those conspiracies. I'll start right at the top with Ms. Wang, who pled guilty to
The court said, "One moment, please."
Mr. Horton said, "Sure."
The court said, "You're going to specify the individuals, correct?"
Mr. Horton said, "So I think what I'll do, Your Honor, is sort of go somewhat in order, and then, given the nature of these conspiracies, there are a number of co-conspirators and agents who were not quite at the periphery. People who were not like Yvette Wong, really."
The court said, "If you could bring the microphone closer to you. You said that there were a number of co-conspirators."
Ms. Shrofa said, "Your Honor, I apologize. 2 of our team members are not here. But I wanted to just apologize and ask the court if I could just flag for the court one issue. There's a witness that's supposed to testify this afternoon, and we do not know what subset of exhibits are being used for that witness. I'm happy to let Mr. Horton continue, but as to Ms. Chin, the government has identified only a wide number of exhibits. I believe Ms. Tilton emailed the government yesterday for a narrower subset. We have not yet received it. While Mr. Horton is making this argument to the court, which I apologize again for interrupting, if the lawyer who is in charge of the Chun Direct could just please send us the exhibit numbers. It would be very helpful to us. Thank you."
Mr. Ferguson said, "We'll be sure to do that, Your Honor. I'm not familiar with that exhibit set. But we'll be sure to send them the specific exhibits. The way we numbered the exhibits for victim witnesses is that each victim witness has its own exhibit series, so we can identify the specific ones within that, but it is identified at least by the exhibit series."
The court said, "So you'll do that right away?"
Mr. Ferguson said, "We will, Your Honor."
Ms. Shrofa said, "Your Honor."
The court said, "One moment."
Ms. Shrofa said, "Oh, sorry."
The court said, "You had something further, Ms. Shroff?"
Ms. Shrofa said, "Yes, Your Honor. I know Mr. Hinton is still going, but for Ms. Chen. We've also received some 3,500 material with new Bates stamp numbering. So if there's any additional 3,500 between yesterday and today, we would appreciate receiving that as well. That's all. Thank you, Your Honor."
The court said, "Thank you. Okay, so I interrupted Mr. Horton, and if you want to backtrack, you may. I specifically wanted to make sure that I have the specific names. Go ahead. Go ahead."
Mr. Horton said, "So there were a number of repeat player co-conspirators, so to speak, that Your Honor saw evidence about in this case. Starting with Ms. Wong, who Your Honor noted early in trial. There was a colloquy with defense counsel about the admissibility of some of her statements. And at the break we talked about the fact that she had pled guilty in fact to conspiring with the defendant, and so her statements came in for the rest of the trial. William J.E., a key co-conspirator. There was evidence about his ownership and control of certain key entities on behalf of the defendant. His transfer of funds between those entities on behalf of the defendant, including proceeds that were retained by himself, and his cooperation with other co-conspirators, including the one I'll go to next, Mile Sun Gua. There's evidence about Mile Sun Gua's use of fraud proceeds to purchase luxury goods. There's documentary evidence of Mile Sun Gua's communications on behalf of entities in the G enterprise. Mile Sun Gua connects to Haren He. There is extensive evidence, including from witnesses who dealt with Mr. He directly, about his role as the paper owner of and operator of a large number of significant G enterprise entities. And of course, he sort of takes center stage at G clubs. Through the testimony of Ms. Reyes and many of the documents Your Honor saw where he is giving direction for G clubs purportedly as its owner. And of course other evidence suggested that he was doing that in connection and conspiracy with the defendant and the defendant's other co-conspirators. So those are the sort of core co-conspirators in the case. And of course there was other evidence that came in. Some of it was resolved in real time. It was somebody who made one or just several appearances. And so
The court said, "So Yinping Wang, William J. Mile Sun Gua and Haren He, correct?"
Mr. Horton said, "That's right. I would call those the core co-conspirators. Of course. There's evidence about Aaron Mitchell, Victor Serta, etc. I would just draw the court's attention to two things. So co-conspirators and agents, and of course the co-conspirator exception is just the sort of more specific species of 801(b)(2), which deals with agent statements in general. When somebody came up and they weren't a repeat player, so to speak. We often went to sidebar and we litigated that in real time and pointed the court to evidence that had come in or was about to come in, and the court ruled during the course of trial. So just to set that stage and reiterate that the standard is a preponderance. We think that there's evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that the elements are met, that if a conspiracy existed, that the co-conspirator declarants were members of that conspiracy with the defendant, and that the statements that we offered, to the extent we offered them for their truth, and of course the court saw. Not all of these co-conspirator and agent statements were offered for their truth. Some of them were offered for their falsity. Some of them were offered for their effects on the witness or other people. But to the extent that they were offered for their truth, we'd submit that the evidence over the last 6 weeks surpasses that preponderance standard that the court uses in making its H&A finding. And as Mr. Ferguson said, we're hopeful to rest today. And we'd submit that the court has more than enough evidence it needs to make that finding today.
The court said, so I believe that the case law calls for me to make any findings after the close of the prosecution's case, and I just don't want to deviate from the formality.
Mr. Horton said, I just wanted to tee it up for your honor. That's all.
The court said, okay. Anything further?
Ms. Schrofa said, Your Honor, I wasn't sure if the court wanted to hear from us or if we could respond when it is properly brought at the end of the government's case, or after the close of the government's case. Obviously, we had no notice that the government was going to address this issue this morning. I don't think Mr. Kamraju was alerted either, so we would appreciate additional time. I would note just 2 short points here. 1, the conspiracy has to exist prior to the admittance of the statement, and a generic statement by the government counsel that a conspiracy existed over a 6-week, I think it's been 6 weeks. Although I've lost count, trial I do not think meets even the preponderance standard. And the government, at least this morning, has just sort of generally addressed Ms. Wang, my son, Mr. He, and William J. I think there were issues with statements made by others, including Dara Lowell. And we would like an opportunity to make sure we have the transcript pages ready for the court and be better prepared before addressing it. Since it should be done after the close of the government's case, we will endeavor to be ready.
The court said, and what is the spelling of the individual's name that you just mentioned?
Ms. Schrofa said, the first name is Dra and the last name is Lewll. For the court's convenience, Your Honor. She is the spouse of Aaron Mitchell, who practiced law, and her testimony was brought out. Or her issue was raised during Amy Buck's testimony.
The court said, of course I will offer the defense an opportunity to address these issues at the close of the prosecution's case.
Ms. Schrofa said, thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Ferguson said, I'm happy to address Ms. Lowell, but we can also table it for later, if Your Honor prefers that.
The court said, I think it's a better idea.
Mr. Ferguson said, okay. And just one update on the other issue Ms. Schroff raised. On the specific exhibits, actually, when I checked my email, the other AUSA had already sent them across, so that one's done.
The court said, all righty. So we will have the witness back on the stand at 9:29 and get started at 9:30.
Ms. Schrofa said, Your Honor, we did receive the email at 9:06 this morning. Thank you.
Recess. At the sidebar.
The court said, I just wanted to make clear that the government needs to specify all the individuals with respect to the H&A application, and of course justify why those statements should be allowed in.
Mr. Horton said, understood. Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Kamraju said, thank you, Your Honor.
In open court.
The court said, please have the jurors brought in.
Continued on next page. Jury present.
The court said, please be seated. Good morning, jurors.
The juror said, good morning.
The court said, we're going to continue with the direct examination of the witness, sir. Remember that you're still under oath. You may continue the inquiry.
Ms. Murray said, "Thank you, Your Honor."
Paul Hinton resumed. Direct examination. By Ms. Murray.
"Good morning, Mr. Hinton."
Good morning.
Ms. Murray said, "Ms. Loftus, can we please put up Government Exhibit Z26 and go to slide 5? Mr. Hinton, while we're waiting for this, can you explain to the jury what tracing is?"
Yes. Tracing, as I use the term, relates to following money through a series of accounts over time.
And how, if at all, do you trace funds through a series of accounts?
Well, you look at the inflows into an account and the subsequent outflows from an account. And then if there are any outflows that go to another account, for example, via a wire transfer, you then have to follow the money to that subsequent account, and then you do the same thing there.
How, if at all? Did you use tracing of funds in the process of checking the accuracy of the information in these summary slides?
Well, strictly, I wasn't asked to do any tracing.
Did you evaluate inflows and outflows in evaluating the accuracy of the information contained on these summary charts?
Yes. For each individual transaction, I was looking at the timing of the flows and the amounts of the flows and which accounts they went between.
And we talked a bit yesterday about the sources of funds that's contained within the summary charts. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And specifically how the government characterized sources of funds for purposes of G clubs. What about GTV and Voice of GWA, or VOG? How did the government instruct Brattle to define source of funds for purposes of those accounts?
For those accounts, we were simply identifying all of the flows for individuals who weren't otherwise identified as being associated with any of the entities that we talked about yesterday that were in the different categories that were shown on my charts.
And for the farms, for sources of funds for purposes of the farms analysis. Did the government provide Brattle with a list of entities or individuals who should be categorized as sources of funds for the farms?
Yes, there was a long series of entities that were associated with farms. And those were shown on the chart as contributing funds through the farms category on the chart.
And finally, the Himalaya Exchange. Did the government identify for you certain companies or bank accounts that were associated with incoming sources of funds for purposes of the summary of the Himalaya Exchange money?
Yes. So again, in terms of the entities that are part of the Himalaya category, those were all defined, listed for us by the government, so we matched those against the transactions. And then anything that was any of the sources of funds that flowed into those entities' accounts came from individuals who weren't otherwise associated with any of these classified entities.
And can you explain, again, as we're waiting, just a few of the other methods that you use to confirm the accuracy of the information contained on the charts as it's reflected in the source bank records that you reviewed?
Yes. So ultimately, after the government determined which of the financial transactions and groups of transactions they wanted to appear on the charts, we used our database to identify what the underlying individual transactions were that would be summed up and displayed on the chart. And then for each of those transactions, we were able to look at the underlying government exhibit, which was a bank record that showed the amount of the transaction.
All right. We now have Government Exhibit Z26 up at slide 5. What is the title of this slide, Mr. Hinton?
This slide is titled GTV of VOG, Select Flows.
And looking at the first-level entities or first-level bank accounts, if I can call them that, from the source of funds into each of the first arrows. Can you just read the entity names that the funds for GTV and VOG flowed to?
Yes. So from sources of funds on the left-hand side, we see the first account is Voice of GWA Media. And it's a Bank of America account, 7226. The second account is also a Voice of GWA Media Incorporated account. This one at Wells Fargo Bank, 5536. The third account is a Soraka Media Group Incorporated account at JP Morgan, 5601. The fourth account is a GTV Media Group Incorporated account at Capital One. And the fifth account is a GTV Media Group Inc. account at JP Morgan, 3335.
And so of those 5 accounts, is it correct that they are held at 4 different banks?
That's correct.
Looking at the center arrow, down to the JP Morgan 5601 Soraka Media account. How much money flowed through sources of funds into that account through June 4th of 2020?
275.9 million.
And then if we could look at the flows out of that account. Can you just read the amounts and the date ranges of when the money flowed out of that account?
Yes. There were 3 flows out of that Soraka account that are shown on this chart to other entities. On the left, 125.5 million between June 3rd and June 10th is transferred to Soraka Media Group, Incorporated's JP Morgan account ending 2038. 200 million is transferred on June 3rd to GTV Media Group's Citibank account 6691 and 10 million on May 13th, 2020 to GTV Media Group, Incorporated Capital One account ending 7000.
And Mr. Hinton, just to be clear, did these summary charts reflect all of the transactions that were contained within the bank records that the government provided you?
No. It's only a selected number of the transactions.
And the bank records that you were provided, were those selected by the government?
They were.
Did Brattle process only a portion of those bank records in the end and reflect those on these charts?
That's correct. We identified a large number. And the government instructed us to process a subset of those.
Can you describe the process by which the government discussed with Brattle which accounts to prioritize for purposes of processing?
Yes. So initially they gave us this huge volume of documents and we had to identify which accounts were contained in those documents. We then generated a list of those accounts, showed them to the government. And the government instructed us which of those accounts were the highest priority and we should process.
Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, could we go to the next slide, please? What's the title of this slide, Mr. Hinton?
This slide is titled VOG, Select Flows.
Looking on the top left, there's a category called Other Inflows. What, if anything, does that represent?
Well, that just shows all the flows into the Voice of Gwa Media accounts that are listed there other than the 26.7 million coming from sources of funds over the time period May 26, 2020 to June 6, 2020.
And there's an individual named on here, Li Hong Wei La Friends. Do you know who that is?
No.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Ms. Loftus, let's go to the next slide. If we could turn now to the farms, Mr. Hinton. Ms. Murray said, if we could go to slide 8, please. So looking here, there are kind of 2 categories on the top. There's farms in green. And then there's sources of funds on the right in gray. First, the farms category showing flows. Does that capture the companies or individuals the government provided and identified to Brattle as associated with the farms?
Yes, that's correct. There's a long list of those.
And what accounts does the 77 million go to from the farms?
It goes to an ACA Capital account at First Abu Dhabi Bank.
Where is First Abu Dhabi Bank located?
In Abu Dhabi, I believe.
From your review of bank records the government provided, do you have an understanding of who, if anyone, control that ACA Capital account?
No.
Mr. Kamraju said, objection.
If we could look now at the
court said, the objection is overruled.
If we could look now at the flow of funds from the ACA Capital account. Let's start on the left. And if you could just read for the jury the amount and then the account holder or holders that the money went to.
Yes. First, 19 million was transferred to Lexington Property and Staffing LLC in 2 accounts. DCB 0625 and Signature 3545.
Sorry. Could you read the signature number again?
Signature 3945. Sorry.
Thank you.
The next transfer shown is 11.2 million transferred to William J. and Singting Rong. And they are at 3 different bank accounts that received that money, 2 Barclays accounts and an HPB account.
And the next flow?
The next flow is 18 million to Hudson Diamond.
Over what time period?
From February 2nd, 2021 to February 10th, 2021.
And where, ultimately, does 16 million go then from the Hudson Diamonds holding account?
Yes, in May through June, 16 million from the Hudson Diamond account is transferred to Lamp Capital LLC.
And just to be clear about the date ranges of that $16 million collective transaction. What was the date range for that flow?
May 28, 21, through July 30, 2021.
All right. Continuing from the ACA Capital account, we just did to Hudson Diamond. What's the next flow represented on the summary?
Well, there's a $13 million transfer from ACA Capital directly to the Lamp Capital accounts.
And then finally, well, not finally, but the next one going to the right.
Yes, the next one is $5 million going to Greenwich Land LLC.
And then the last flow that we see going kind of 3 o'clock.
Is $32 million to Savio Law.
Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, I'd like to pull up Government Exhibit GXPNC 39 at page 3, please. Focusing on that last transaction that you just mentioned, or the last flow you just mentioned, Mr. Hinton. The $32 million to Savio Law. Ms. Murray said, all right. And if we could go to page 3, please. Actually, sorry, let's go to the top of the page. Ms. Loftus. Mr. Hinton, is this one of the bank records that you were provided by the government in this case?
It is.
Is this one of the records that you reviewed to confirm the accuracy of the charts we've been talking about? Including Z26.
It is.
Looking at the top left, what is listed in the bold and then, underneath that, on the very top left?
It says IOLTA checking.
And beneath that?
PNC Bank.
What is the time period for this particular bank statement?
October 31st, 2020, through November 30th, 2020.
And then beneath that, can you read the entity name and the address associated with this account?
Savio Law at 3, Dale Court, Hazlet, New Jersey.
Under Savio Law LLC, there's a description. Can you read that to the jury, please?
IOLTA Attorney Trust Account.
Do you have any independent knowledge of whether Savio Law LLC is a law firm?
No.
And looking on the right, what are the last 4 of the account number we're looking at here?
8,162.
Ms. Murray said, all right. We can now go to page 3, Ms. Loftus. And let's focus on activity details. Deposits and other additions. Mr. Hinton. Do you see the transactions that are listed here for deposits and other additions in this account?
I do.
What are the date ranges of the top 4 transactions?
From November 12th to November 16th.
And what are the amounts of each, just from the top down?
Yes. 9.5 million, 8.5 million, 7.5 million, and 6,499,935.
Mr. Hinton. Did those 4 transactions collectively represent the $32 million that we just looked at in the flow from ACA Capital to Savio Law?
Yes. Please.
Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, we can go back to Z26, and we were at page 8. All right. So this is the broader summary of the farm flows, Mr. Hinton. I'd like to now go and drill down on a few of the different flows. Ms. Murray said, if we could go to the next page, please, Ms. Loftus. Looking beneath Savio Law and ACA Capital and what's now the blank space, if we can go to the next slide. Please, Mr. Hinton, what are the 2 flows that are reflected here that occurred on October 15, 2020?
There's a $5 million transfer to Greenwich Land LLC and there's a $5 million transfer to Lamp Capital.
And at which bank were the accounts held that received those $5 million transfers on October 15, 2020?
Bank of Princeton.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Ms. Loftus, let's go to the next slide now, please. And then what do we see reflected here, Mr. Hinton? From ACA Capital to Greenwich Land and then the flow out to the right?
Right. So in October, between October 21st and 23rd, 2020, $5 million was transferred from ACA Capital to Greenwich Land, then subsequently on October, between October 26th and November 20th, 2020. $9 million was transferred from Greenwich Land to Lamp Capital.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Let's go to the next slide, please, Ms. Loftus. This is another portion of the broader farms chart that we were just looking at, Mr. Hinton. Can you just explain, generally, starting with farms and going down to the account that's highlighted in yellow? What type of flows we're looking at here in this summary?
Yes. This is just showing those flows from the previous chart that went from farms. 77 million transferred to ACA Capital and then 2 transfers from ACA Capital to 2 different entities. Hudson Diamond receiving 18 million and Lamp Capital receiving 13 million from ACA Capital. And of that, there's also a subsequent transfer from Hudson Diamond holding of 16 million into Lamp Capital.
And just to make sure that we're reading this correctly, so the farms, 77 million to ACA Capital, ultimately. Does $29 million go into the Lamp Capital LLC account, as represented in these transactions?
Yes, ultimately. The account that received the $77 million from farms subsequently transferred money to Lamp Capital with 13 million and 18 to Hudson. Hudson Diamond then subsequently transferred 16 million to Lamp Capital, so together, there's 29 million coming into Lamp Capital.
Ms. Murray said, and let's go the next slide, please, Ms. Loftus. On this slide, Mr. Hinton, we're starting with what was the terminus of the last slide. The Lamp Capital account, is that correct?
Yes.
And what is the title of this slide?
It's Farms, Select Expenses from Lamp Capital Accounts.
Mr. Hinton, does this slide reflect just a subset of outflows from the Lamp Capital Signature Bank account?
It does.
And who selected which transactions to reflect on this slide?
The government.
I want to look at some of the records underlying these transactions. But first, Mr. Hinton, if you could just read the categories that are shown in the bubble starting from left to right for the flows here.
Yes. The select expenses include correlated expenses, Yotsu LLC expenses, Akas Canada Limited, Cirrus Design Corporation, Maiguo, and Cheongguo.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Ms. Loftus, let's go to Government Exhibit SIG 102 and go to page 4. I want to look at one of the correlated expenses that was reflected on the slide we just looked at. Slide 13. Actually, focusing on the first page, thank you, Ms. Loftus, just looking at the statement itself. What is the statement period we're looking at here, Mr. Hinton?
The statement period is May 1st through 31st.
And what year?
2021.
Sorry. I spoke over you. What year?
2021.
And is this one of the bank records the government provided to you which you reviewed in connection with checking the accuracy of the summary charts?
It is.
Looking on the left, what is the name and the address for this particular bank account?
It's Lamp Capital LLC at 667 Madison Avenue, New York, New York.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Ms. Loftus, let's zoom out of that and go to page 4, please. Thank you. And if we could highlight the May 27th, the larger entry here. Mr. Hinton, do you see that transaction as reflected in this bank record?
I do.
Looking at that, what type of transaction is reflected here, for May 27, 2021, from this Lamp Capital account?
It's an outgoing wire.
And 2 lines down, to whom was that outgoing wire sent?
The wire transfer was made to Wells Fargo bank account 8296, which was for the benefit of Miller Motorcars, Inc.
What was the dollar amount of that outgoing wire to Miller Motorcars from Lamp Capital?
It was $294,306.
Ms. Murray said, skipping around on the expenses, if we could look on the same page, Ms. Loftus, the second entry, May 19th of 2021. What type of transaction is reflected here, Mr. Hinton?
This is also an outgoing wire transfer.
And looking 2 lines down, to whom was this outgoing wire sent?
It was sent to Maiguo.
What was the dollar amount of this outgoing wire from Lamp Capital to Maiguo on May 19, 2021?
It was $500,000.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Ms. Loftus, let's go now, please, to Z26 again at slide 13. I just want to look back at where we see the transactions we just saw reflected on this chart. So Mr. Hinton, the Miller motor cars, where, if anywhere, on this summary chart is that sum included?
It's in the red-lined bubble that's titled Correlated Expenses.
And the $500,000 to Megwa, where, if anywhere on this summary slide, is that transaction reflected?
That's the second line from the right with the lavender-colored bubble at the bottom.
All right. We're going to look now, Mr. Hinton, at one of the records for ACAS Canada Limited, which is the third arrow flow on this chart.
Mr. Horton said, if we could please go to Government Exhibit NJ808, page 2.
And just to clarify, not looking at one of the bank records but looking at one of the government exhibits relating to that particular flow. Mr. Hinton, do you know what kind of company ACAS Canada Limited is?
No.
So this is a government exhibit titled NJ808. Have you seen this before?
I don't recall.
Focusing on the top, Ms. Loftus, if we could zoom in, the company name/service provider listed here. Could you read that for us, please, Mr. Hinton? Ms. Murray said, if we're able to zoom in on that, please, Ms. Loftus. So it's under company name entry there, the first line, the first long line. Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, can you highlight that, please?
Yes, so it says company name, ACAS Canada Limited, and then afterwards it has in quotes service provider. So I believe the service provider you're referring to is ACAS Canada Limited.
Ms. Murray said, and let's zoom out of that, please, Ms. Loftus, and let's look further down the page. Focusing now on the bottom, just the agreed by through to the right side. Mr. Hinton, looking here. Agreed by service provider, what is in that field on this document?
It's ACAS Canada Limited.
And who is listed on the right as the customer?
Agreed to by customer Whitecroft Limited, and then there's a signature and a printed name.
What is the printed name?
The printed name is Megwa.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Let's zoom out of that, please, Ms. Loftus. And if we could focus again just on the very top paragraph, in accordance with Mr. Hinton, looking at this portion of this document. Can you just read the first sentence through to the first comma?
Yes. In accordance with paragraph C6 of the corporate care terms as incorporated in an aircraft enrollment contract. The customer, Whitecroft Limited, hereby authorizes, etc.
And in this text, what type of contract is referenced?
It's an aircraft enrollment contract.
Thank you. Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, let's take that down now and go to Government Exhibit VK10 at page 58. It's VK10 at page 58. Oh, sorry. UK10. If we could look at the top of this, please. Mr. Hinton, have you seen this document before?
I don't recall whether I've reviewed this one individually.
What is the title on this page of Government Exhibit UK10?
It's Initial Deposit Wire Transfer.
Who is listed as the customer on this document?
Megwa.
And the account name a few lines down?
Is Wells Fargo Bank.
Oh, not the bank name, sorry, the account name, a couple of lines down.
Oh, I'm sorry. Cirrus Design Corporation is the account.
A few lines further down from that, there's a deposit amount in USD. Do you see that?
I do.
What is that amount?
It's $95,000.
Ms. Murray said, could we zoom out of it, Ms. Loftus, so we can see more of this page? And let's go to the next page, please. Mr. Hinton, what's the title of this page of Government Exhibit UK10? This is page 59.
This page is titled Second Deposit Wire Transfer.
And the customer name here?
Megwa.
Again, a few lines down, the account name for this second deposit wire transfer?
The account name is Cirrus Design Corporation.
And a few lines below that, deposit amount in US dollars?
It's $206,700.
And the next line on this document, what is the field and then what is the information in that field?
Yes. It says, aircraft reference, Vision SF-50G2 position.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Ms. Loftus, let's go again to Z26, page 13. Just to see where the transactions we just reviewed are reflected. So here, Mr. Hinton, can you explain to the jury where we see those two entities we just looked at? ACAS and Cirrus Design.
They are the black ovals that are towards the bottom middle of the chart.
And finally, I'd like to look at the 20 million on the right side of this chart that goes to Changhua. And do you know who that individual is, Mr. Hinton?
I do not.
All right. What is the date range of that $20 million collective transfer?
It's May 18th, 21, through June 1st.
Of what year?
Of 2021.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Ms. Loftus, let's go to Government Exhibit 3200, please. Focusing first on the top of this document, Mr. Hinton. Is this one of the bank records that you reviewed in connection with your work verifying the summary charts?
Yes.
At the top, what is the date for this account statement?
It is December 14th, 2021.
And looking on the right, there are 3 letters on the top right. Do you see those?
I do.
What do those reflect?
CHF I believe refers to Swiss francs.
And the name beneath that?
Changhua.
Ms. Murray said, let's go to the next page, please, Ms. Loftus. Oh, actually, let's stay here for a moment. Mr. Hinton, the first line on this account statement, what was the balance of this account as of July 31st, 2020?
It indicates a zero balance on that date.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Let's go to the next slide, please. And the next slide. Excuse me. Looking here, Mr. Hinton, again, the top line, the balance brought forward as of July 31st, 2020. What is that amount as reflected here?
It's a zero balance.
Can you read the next entry on this bank statement, starting with the date?
On May 19th, 2021. There's a credit transaction that's referred to as bonification from Lamp Capital LLC for $7 million.
And how do you know that that's denominated in US dollars, based on this bank record?
Well, this particular page of the statement has USD at the top right.
Ms. Murray said, and Ms. Loftus, let's go to the next slide, please. Focusing on the third line on this page of the bank statement, what is the date of that transaction? And can you explain the details?
The date of that transaction is the 2nd of June and 2021. And it's a $13 million credit from bonification. It says bonification from Lamp Capital. So it's my understanding is that's a transfer to this account from Lamp Capital of $13 million.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Ms. Loftus, go back to Z26, slide 13. Mr. Hinton, those two transactions we just looked at, the 7 million and the 13 million. Are those collectively the 20 million reflected on the right side flow on this summary chart?
They are.
Ms. Murray said, go to the next slide. I'd like to talk through G clubs and Crane a bit. First of all, Mr. Hinton. Who determined that Crane accounts were associated with the G clubs category for purposes of these summaries?
The government.
Do you have any independent knowledge of what Crane is?
I do not.
All right. Looking at this, there's a lot going on, so we're going to break it down a little bit. Does this show the flow of certain sources of funds that were within the category of G clubs and Crane that the government identified?
Yes, certain selected funds and certain selected accounts, yes.
And does this slide reflect just a subset of the flows that went to and through the various G club and Crane accounts?
Yes, it's just a subset.
Let's look at a couple of the transactions that are reflected here. Ms. Murray said, Ms. Loftus, if we could go. Well, first of all, Mr. Hinton. Can you just explain the color scheme that we have going on here a bit so the jury understands what those colors reflect?
Yes. The idea here is to use the same color for all the different accounts for the same entity or groups of entities. So the G Clubs entities are shown in dark blue, the Crane entities are shown in light blue. And the Hamilton and Himalaya entities are shown in yellow.
And up on the top right there is an inflow from farms to Crane Advisory. What color is reflected for farms?
Yes, we are consistently using green to indicate farms entities.
All right. So let's break this down a little bit. Ms. Murray said, if we could go to the next slide, please, Ms. Loftus. Focusing now, Mr. Hinton, on the G Club's portion of this summary of selected flows. Can you just narrate us a bit through the various flows that end up in the G Club Operations Morgan Stanley account? The 3 accounts listed here.
Yes. Between February 3, 2021 and July 9, 2021, $8.6 million was transferred to those Morgan Stanley G Club accounts that are listed in the box there from sources of funds.
And in looking at the other inflows into those Morgan Stanley accounts, as reflected here. Just at a high level, where do we see the money coming from and into those Morgan Stanley accounts?
They are coming from other G Club operations accounts at 2 different banks.
Starting on the left. Can you read kind of the left bottom from the signature account going around clockwise?
Certainly. So there's a G Clubs Operations LLC account at Signature Bank, 3576. And that account transferred $14.5 million on January 11, 2021, to the Morgan Stanley G Club Operations account. Then next in the rotation, there's a G Club's Operations account at, I think it's First Bank, 7085, and there's a $52.2 million transfer on December 17, 2020, to the Morgan Stanley G Club Operations accounts. And finally, there's a separate First Bank account for G Club Operations ending 7052. The transfer is $100,000 on December 29, 2020.
And Mr. Hinton. Each of those 3 transfers that you just discussed had a single date associated with them, is that correct?
That's correct.
Was each of those an individual transaction into the G Club's Morgan Stanley account?
I believe so, but that's based on my memory.
And then looking from the Morgan Stanley accounts. What are the 2 outgoing flows that are reflected on this summary chart?
Yes, there's a $10 million collection of outflows on January 21, 2021, through February 4, 2021, to Fiesta Property Developments Limited. And there's a series of transfers to a G Club's international account at Mercantile Bank that summed to $62.7 million over the period August 20, 21 through October 8, 2021.
Mr. Hinton, do you know what Fiesta Property Developments Limited is?
I do not.
Ms. Murray said, all right. Let's go to the next slide, Ms. Loftus. I'd like to focus now on the Crane portion of the select flows reflected here. We're not going to go through this in every transaction detail, Mr. Hinton. But just starting with the arrow straight down from sources of funds to the city account, 5278. What amount is represented there?
$59.5 million.
And over what time period?
November 23, 2020 through April 1, 2021.
And then following that arrow straight down. What is the next flow that's reflected here from that city account?
Yes. That same city account for Crane Advisory Group at Citibank transfers $58.2 million to Crane Advisory Group at Morgan Stanley.
And I want to focus just briefly on the Crane Advisory Group account on the far right. The capital 10887 account. Do you see that?
I do.
Continued on next page. By Ms. Murray.
There are both inflows and outflows for that account, is that correct?
Yes.
Looking at other inflows above, which is going down the $25.3 million. What types of transactions does that reflect on this chart?
Those are all the transactions over that time period that aren't coming from the other entities the explicitly listed on the chart.
And then there's an outflow or outflows over a time period, the $42 million. Which accounts and over what time period does that money flow from Capital One?
Between May 28 and July 13, 2021.
And that goes to Crane Advisory accounts held at what bank?
At Morgan Stanley.
Ms. Murray said, let's go to the next slide please, Ms. Loftus, and marry those 2, the G Club and the Crane. Looking at this now brings those together. And in particular there's a flow just to the left of the middle of the page from Crane Advisory Group's Morgan Stanley accounts to the G Club Morgan Stanley accounts. If would highlight that, Ms. Loftus. What is the dollar amount of that collective transfer from Crane to G Club?
The aggregate amount of the transfers between the Morgan Stanley accounts for Crane Advisory and the Morgan Stanley accounts for G Club operations over that period is $87.1 million.
What is the period for that $87.1 million transfer?
It's a series of transfers over the period May 24, 2021 through July 2, 2021.
Ms. Loftus, let's go to the next slide and build in the Himalaya exchange entities. Mr. Hinton. Now looking at the accounts we just ended with, the G Club Morgan Stanley accounts. What is the outflow reflected here over the period of May 6, 2021 to June 23, 2021?
$85 million.
If you could highlight that for the jury, please, Ms. Loftus, on the left from G Club to Hamilton. And then looking from that Hamilton Digital Assets account we see another flow in the amount of $85 million. Is that right?
That is correct.
What is the period of time for that aggregation of flows?
From September 1, 2021 through September 16.
And that goes to a bank account held in what name?
Hamilton Opportunity Fund.
At what bank?
At Silvergate Bank, 9306.
Focusing now on that Silvergate account, the Hamilton Opportunity Fund. There's also another incoming flow above from a Himalaya International Clearing entity. Do you see that?
I do.
What is the dollar amount of that?
It's $25 million.
Let's build in the next slide, please, Ms. Loftus. Looking on the right now, Mr. Hinton. We're looking in the September and October 2021 time period with a series of flows to Lowell and Mitchell, LLC account. Do you see that?
I do.
Can you read the dollar amounts and the dates of the inflows into that account from the various Crane accounts as reflected on this chart?
The Morgan Stanley account sends $6.8 million on October 19th. The IDB Bank account sent $1.6 million on the 27th of September. The Signature Bank account sends $2.3 million between September 27th and October 12th, 2021. And the Crane Advisory account at Capital One sends $37 million on September 26, 2021.
Let's go to the next slide. I want to continue along in our chronology here on this summary. So we're looking again in the middle of the page Hamilton Opportunity Silvergate account. There's now an outgoing flow from that account on October 27, 2021. Do you see that?
I do.
What is the dollar amount of that flow?
$59 million.
And that goes from a Hamilton Opportunity Fund account held at what bank to a Hamilton Opportunity account held at what bank?
This transfer between two Silvergate accounts for the same entity, Hamilton Opportunity Fund. So it had a 9,306 account that transferred to the 7,747 account.
Let's go to the next slide please, Ms. Loftus. What do we see here?
We see the same amount being transferred on the same day from the Silvergate 7747 account to a third Hamilton Opportunity Fund account at Silvergate numbered 7739.
And those $59 million transfers from Hamilton Opportunity Fund accounts. Those transfers are on the same day among different accounts, is that correct?
That's right.
Let's go to the next slide, please. So there's now an account at the bottom of this slide listed as Silvergate 7713. Do you see that?
I do.
In what entity name is that account held?
That's also Hamilton Opportunity Fund SPC.
And let's look at the inflows then into that account from both the Hamilton Opportunity Fund SPC 7721 Silvergate account on the left and the Hamilton Opportunity Fund SPC 7739 Silvergate account on the right?
Yes. There's $5.6 million transferred on November 15, 2021 from the Silvergate 7721 to the Silvergate 7713 accounts.
And then looking on right, the incoming transfer to 7,713 from 7739?
Yes, that's $46.5 million on December 2, 2021.
Let's go to the next slide, please, Ms. Loftus. Mr. Hinton. This is now again a subset of the broader G Club/Crane summary chart we've been looking at. As you can see, there's a highlight on this G Club International Limited account at Mercantile Bank. Do you see that?
I do.
And the inflows reflected on this chart into that account. What is the amount from the G Club Operations Morgan Stanley account?
62.7 million.
Let's go to the next slide, please. What is the title of this slide, Mr. Hinton?
G Club Select Flows and Expenses.
Here looking at the top. Are we starting with this summary flow analysis from the account we just saw on the prior slide that the 62.7 million came into?
We are.
Focusing on a few of the outflows that are reflected here. Let's start on the right with the blue. What is shown with the outflows on the right to Yacht Zoo, LLC?
It shows that between October 26, 2021 and September 1, 2022, $478,000 was transferred.
Then looking to the red, what category of transactions is reflected in the summary chart here?
The red symbols are associated with car-related expenses.
What is the dollar amount for those collective car-related expenses?
6.4 million.
The prior car-related expenses that we looked at, Mr. Hinton. Those were expenses that originated from a different bank account, is that correct?
That's correct.
The Lamp Capital account?
That's correct.
And these are expenses from an account held in what entity's name?
G Club International Limited.
Continuing on, there's an entry called Stone Offer Design. Do you see that?
I do.
From what accounts do we see transactions flowing into Stone Offer Design?
We see payments from both the G Club International Mercantile account and from G Club's operations in a separate TD bank account.
Looking left, Mr. Hinton, there is a Sources of Funds section over on the top left. And that flows into both the G Club Operations account and the Himalaya International Clearing account. Do you see that?
I do.
Does the money that's reflected in the sources of funds, does that include incoming sources of funds that the government identified for Brattle?
Yes. These are sources of funds coming from entities that we previously described how the government instructed us to identify.
And based on the information on this slide, does that include sources of funds for both Himalaya Exchange, which would be shown in the flow to Himalaya International Clearing, and for G Clubs, which is shown in the flow to G Club Operations?
It does.
Let's focus on the far left side of this. We have a flow into G Club Operations. Where then do we see $7 million going between March 2, 2022 and April 12, 2022?
There are aggregate transfers to, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name of the Swiss bank. But it's right there.
I represent to you that it's Kyrgyz Swiss Bank.
Thank you.
Let's look at those transactions from the bank records. Ms. Loftus, if we could go to Government Exhibit TDB 93. We'll start on the first page, Ms. Loftus. Mr. Hinton. Is this one of the bank records that you reviewed in connection with your work in this case?
It is.
What's the statement period for this record?
It's January 14, 2022 through January 31st of the same year.
And what is the entity name and the address that this account is held in?
It's G Club Operations, LLC, 162 East 64th Street, New York, New York.
And the last four of the primary account number on the right side?
2044.
On the account summary here, what's the beginning balance in this account on this statement period?
It has a zero beginning balance.
Let's go to page 8, please, Ms. Loftus, and scroll down. On the other withdrawals, Mr. Hinton. Can you read that first withdrawal, March 2nd?
Yes. March 2nd, there's a wire transfer outgoing to KYRGYZ Swiss Bank 3 million.
And then let's go to page 12, please, Ms. Loftus. And scroll down to the other withdrawal section there. On the first entry for April 12th here, Mr. Hinton, do you see that?
Yeah, this is a similarly titled wire transfer outgoing for $4 million.
And what bank does that go to?
It's going to KYRGYZ Swiss Bank.
So those two transactions, the 3 million and the 4 million. Do those collectively represent the $7 million that we saw in the flow on the summary chart at Z26 page 25?
They do.
Ms. Loftus, let's go back to Z26. Let's go to slide 26. I want to talk through now at a high level about some of the Himalaya exchange flows. Mr. Hinton. Starting on the left top here, sources of funds. Again. Do the sources of funds reflected on the Himalaya exchange flow summary? Are those the same category of funds that we discussed earlier?
Yes.
So the leftmost line, just taking us straight down the line. If you could just read the dollar amount and the date ranges and what accounts that money flows through.
Yes. 473.8 million is the aggregate amount of transfers from sources of funds to Himalaya International Clearing FEV 3763 account between June 2, 2021 and June 30, 2022.
And then from that FV Bank International Clearing account. What do we see reflected inflows between March 21st and May 13th of 2022?
80 million in aggregate transfers to a different Himalaya International Clearing Limited account at the same bank. But this account ends in 2119.
And then from there, what is the next flow reflected here?
Yes. Then from March 5, 2022 through May 13, 2022. There's 30 million flowing to a mercantile account for Himalaya International Financial Group Limited.
And looking kind of in the middle of the slide, Mr. Hinton. There's another Himalaya International Clearing account. Do you see that? It's 0133.
I do.
At what bank is that held?
That's also at Mercantile Bank.
How much money flows into that account as reflected here from both clearing at FV Bank 3763 and from sources of fund?
There's 220 million in aggregate coming from FE Bank Himalaya International Clearing Limited and 36.9 coming from sources of funds. So together that's 256.9 million.
And then there's another inflow reflected here going to the clearing account at Mercantile Bank. That's from the right side. What is that amount, and what account does that come from, or what entity?
Yes. That's a $50 million transfer on December 2nd, 2021 from G Club International Limited.
So that's $50 million from G Club International to Himalaya International Clearing, is that right?
That's right.
And then looking at the outflow from the Himalaya International Clearing at Mercantile to Hamilton Opportunity Fund. What is the aggregate dollar amount of that outflow?
51 million.
And what is the Hamilton Opportunity Fund bank account that money goes to?
It's a Silvergate account ending 7739.
Let's go to the next slide, please, Ms. Loftus. I want to focus on the bottom flow that's reflected here. Mr. Hinton. From that Himalaya International Financial Group Mercantile account we discussed, the 0139. What flow did we see on April 15, 2022?
We see a $37 million transfer to Zeisler and Zeisler, PC, IOLTA account.
Do you know what Zeisler and Zeisler PC is?
I understand it's a law firm.
Do you know what role, if any, Zeisler and Zeisler has in the government's case?
I do not.
Let's go to the next slide. Focusing on just one of the categories of expenses that we had discussed in connection with some of the transactions from the various accounts. On the next slide, Ms. Loftus. Mr. Hinton, what is the title of this slide?
This slide is titled Yotsu, LLC Expenses Summary.
What is at the top of this slide?
It's an oval representing Yotsu, LLC.
Going from left to the right counterclockwise, does this represent various different inflows to Yotsu LLC from different accounts we've been discussing?
Yes. They are essentially expenses of those accounts, monies that are being transferred to Yotsu LLC's account.
What is the aggregate amount of money just from the bank transactions reflected on this summary chart that goes to Yotsu LLC between May 7, 2020 and October 21, 2022? In the middle there, Ms. Loftus.
Yes, it's 3.9 million.
And so starting on the left with the Lamp Capital Signature account. What's the date range of that 1.8 million aggregate flows?
1.8 million.
What's the date range?
It's May 7th, 2021 through September 13th, 2021.
And the next account, the IDB account held in the name of Lamp Capital. What's the date range for those Yacht Zoo, LLC payments?
October 25th through December 20th, 2021.
And in the middle there, Lamp Capital, LLC, DCB or Dime Community Bank. What is the dollar amount that goes up to Yacht Zoo from that account?
$990,000.
Continuing right, HCHK Tech. What is the date of the transfers to Yacht Zoo from that account?
October 21st, 2022.
By the way, you see money going from G Club as well to Yacht Zoo. What is the dollar amount of that collection of transactions?
$478,000.
Let's just take a look at one of those for the HCHK Tech transfer to Yacht Zoo, LLC. Ms. Loftus. If you could pull up Government Exhibit MTB 83. Let's focus on the top first. What is the last four of the account number looking on the right here?
The account number ends in 2176.
And the statement period for this particular bank record?
October 1st through October 31st, 2022.
What is the name and address for this particular bank account?
It's HCHK Technologies, Inc., 750 Lexington Avenue, New York, New York.
Let's zoom out, Ms. Loftus, and look down the page a bit. If we could look at the second entry for October 21st, 2022. Do you see that, Mr. Hinton?
I do.
What is the description of that transaction as reflected in this HCHK Tech Bank record?
Its entry says outgoing chips transfer order Rep Yacht Zoo Limited G Fashion Hold Company. B. Lee.
Do you know what G Fashion Hold Company B. Lee refers to?
I imagine it's a G Fashion entity.
And looking to the right, the second column which shows the transaction amount. What is that transaction amount here?
$123,452.
Let's go back to Z26, slide 30, Ms. Loftus. Is that then the 123,000 rounded that we see reflected on this summary chart?
It is.
Let's continue, and let's go to the next slide. Mr. Hinton. Is this kind of a high-level summary of the sources of funds for the primary categories that we've been looking at over the course of your testimony?
It is.
And if you could just take us through left to right and again, just for clarity. The summary charts that we've been reviewing, Mr. Hinton. Is it correct that these reflect only a portion of the total transactions that were in the records that Brattle received?
That's correct.
And is it also correct that Brattle did not process every bank record that it received from the government?
That's correct, yes.
So sources of funds, what is the approximate aggregate flow to the GTV/VOG category?
Of all the transactions that we processed, of which there were thousands for this category, the aggregate amount was $411 million going to GTV and VOG.
And what about for the farms category? What's the aggregate amount of sources of funds that flowed to the farms category that the government identified?
Of the transactions we processed, there's $110 million worth of transactions categorized as going from sources of funds to farms entities.
What about the G Clubs category?
Likewise for the G Clubs category, we identified and processed $240 million of individual transactions from sources of funds accounts.
And finally the Himalaya Exchange category. What is the aggregate amount of processed money flowing to that category?
$517 million.
Ms. Loftus, can we go to the next slide, please? This sums it up for us, Mr. Hinton. Among those four broad categories, what amount do we see going from sources of funds into those categories?
Collectively they make up $1.3 billion.
And let's go to the next slide. What is reflected here at the bottom of this slide for outflows from that broad $1.3 billion worth of sources of funds?
Yes. At the bottom of the slide we are indicating that there were outflows collectively from these four entities. Entities that were classified into these four categories. From all of the transactions that we processed, we were able to identify net inflows into these two other groups of accounts.
And so looking first at the left, family offices and family members. Is that a collective category reflective of what we saw yesterday on Government Exhibit Z27, where the government identified who qualifies as a family member or what qualifies as a family office?
Right. I think you're referring to that beautifully multicolored list of all the different accounts. And we had a column for family offices and family members. And at the bottom there was a footnote that described what were the entities that were classified in that column.
And for purposes of this summary chart, is the classification the same for family offices and members here as it was on that other summary chart?
Yes, it is.
What are the net inflows we see from the collective $1.3 billion going to either family offices or family members?
We compute that the net amount of inflows, that means the amount coming in less whatever amounts went out, is $100 million.
And then looking on the right, companies owned by William J.E. Are those the companies we discussed yesterday that the government identified for you? The Hamilton and ACA capital entities?
That's correct.
And of the aggregate $1.3 billion, what approximate amount of net inflows do we see going into those companies? The William J.E. companies?
From these four different entities we see net inflows to the ACA capital and Hamilton accounts of $550 million.
Let's go to the next slide, please, Ms. Loftus. What's the title of this slide, Mr. Hinton?
This is titled Cumulative Sources of Funds Inflows by Category.
Is this a different visual representation of the $1.3 billion sources of funds money that we just looked at on the prior slides?
Yes, it just shows how it built up over time.
Can you explain for the jury what the different colors represent and how they build over time as we go from 2020 here to 2023?
Yes. Well, because we're building up this number from all the individual over 200,000 transactions. We have the date of every single transaction, so it's possible to compute a daily. In this case we do it monthly. But a cumulative amount of the inflows into all the accounts that are classified into these four different categories, each one having a different color. So underlying each of those bands of color are many, many individual entities. And for each of those entities many individual accounts that are receiving money in the form of sources of funds.
And the amounts that are totaled within each color band, Mr. Hinton. Are those the amounts associated with the categories indicated on the bottom of this chart?
Those are the amounts that you get to by the end of July 2023. You can see that in each case they sort of build up at different points in time to reach that total.
And then starting at the bottom of this chart working up. Is it correct based on the key at the bottom and the colors that we start with GTV/VOG, add on the farms? Then G Club and finally starting at some point it looks like in late 2022 the Himalaya Exchange?
Yes, just by stacking them up you can see what they sum to altogether.
Mr. Hinton. In this case for purposes of the summary exhibits that we reviewed with the jury yesterday and today, is it correct that the government prepared or advised what information it wanted reflected on those summary charts?
It did.
And in the course of either preparing or reviewing those summary charts, did you and Brattle take instruction from the government?
We did.
Ms. Murray said, "May I have a moment, Your Honor?"
The court said you may.
Ms. Murray said, "Thank you, Mr. Hinton. I have nothing further."
The court said, cross-examination.
Mr. Kamraju said, "Thank you, Your Honor."
Cross-examination. By Mr. Kamraju.
Good morning, Mr. Hinton.
Good morning.
Mr. Kamraju said, "Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping, Your Honor. At this time I'd like to read a stipulation between the parties."
The court said, go ahead.
Mr. Kamraju said, "Could we please pull up Government Exhibit Stip 14, please? And it's in evidence already so we can publish it. It is hereby stipulated and agreed by the United States of America and Miles Gua, the defendant. The below-listed exhibits were lawfully obtained by the government and are authentic records of the entity listed in column A that were made at or near the time by or from information transmitted by a person with knowledge of matters set forth in the records. Such records were kept in the course of the regularly conducted activity. And it was a regular practice of the entity to make the records. And then could we go to page 8 of this stipulation? It is further stipulated and agreed that the defense exhibits listed in column C may be received as defense exhibits at trial. Then can we go back to the front page? Please. Your Honor, pursuant to this stipulation, I'm going to offer several exhibits at this time.
The court said, all righty.
Ms. Murray said, no objection.
Mr. Kumraju said, so the defense offers DX 11124 through 11129, DX 11255, DX 11432 through 11436, DX 10299 through DX 10301, DX 13005 through DX 10329, DX 10526. DX 10528 through DX 10530, DX 10551 through DX 10562, DX 10564 through DX 10577, DX 11299 through DX 11300, DX 11302, DX 11304 and DX 11305, DX 11485, DX 11486 through DX 11488, DX 11489, DX 11491 through DX 11492, DX 11548 through DX 11549, DX 11552 through DX 11553, DX 11562 through DX 11570, DX 10430 through DX 10457, DX 10960 through DX 10971, DX 11073 through DX 11078, DX 11110 through DX 11121, DX 11493 through DX 11506, DX 10007, DX 10531, DX 10606 through DX 10626, DX 10008 through DX 10010, DX 10330 through DX 10356, DX 10578 through DX 10605, DX 11256 through DX 11257, DX 11281, DX 11517 through DX 11526, DX 11572 through DX 11573, DX 11581, DX 11585, DX 10357 through DX 10359, DX 10627 through DX 10631, DX 10972, DX 10013, DX 10017 through DX 10028, DX 10360 through DX 10373.
Counsel conferred.
Mr. Kumraju said, if it will speed it along, Your Honor, I'll offer every exhibit in column C of the stipulation.
The court said, they are admitted.
Defendants Exhibits DX 11124 through 11129, DX 11255, DX 11432 through 11436, DX 10299 through DX 10301, DX 13005 through DX 10329, DX 10526, DX 10528 through DX 10530, DX 10551 through DX 10562, DX 10564 through DX 10577, DX 11299 through DX 11300, DX 11302, DX 11304 and DX 11305, DX 11485, DX 11486 through DX 11488, DX 11489, DX 11491 through DX 11492, DX 11548 through DX 11549, DX 11552 through DX 11553, DX 11562 through DX 11570, DX 10430 through DX 10457, DX 10960 through DX 10971, DX 11073 through DX 11078, DX 11110 through DX 11121, DX 11493 through DX 11506, DX 10007, DX 10531, DX 10606 through DX 10626, DX 10008 through DX 10010, DX 10330 through DX 10356, DX 10578 through DX 10605, DX 11256 through DX 11257, DX 11281, DX 11517 through DX 11526, DX 11572 through DX 11573, DX 11581, DX 11585, DX 10357 through DX 10359, DX 10627 through DX 10631, DX 10972, DX 10013, DX 10017 through DX 10028, DX 10360 through DX 10373, received in evidence.
Mr. Kamraju said, "Thank you."
By Mr. Kamraju.
Just one other housekeeping detail, Mr. Hinton, can you confirm for the jury, please? Sir, that you are not in fact a Chinese spy?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, Brattle was first retained by the government in the summer of 2023, correct?
Yes.
And Brattle has a team working on this project, right?
Yes.
And you were involved from the start of Brattle's engagement, correct?
Correct.
And over the course of that engagement, Brattle has been compensated for its work by the government?
That's correct.
And I believe you testified on direct you receive about $2 million, correct?
Well, I think that's an estimate of the amount of fees. I'm not sure what's been collected.
You're owed $2 million.
As I said, I think we've accrued certain amounts of fees.
That work entailed doing the fund analysis that you testified about on direct among other things. Correct?
That's right.
And you only learned about GTV from the prosecutors, right?
Yes.
You only learn about the farm loan program from the prosecutors, correct?
Yes.
Same with G clubs, right?
Yes.
And the same with the Himalaya exchange, right?
Yes.
Now, did you learn about Mr. Gua from the prosecutors?
No.
When did you first hear of him?
When the government contacted us.
Your testimony today was about summaries you prepared of evidence in this case, right?
Yes.
And the prosecutor provided you with the evidence they wanted you to summarize, right?
They provided us with a large number of documents at the beginning we had to sort of identify. And then they selected certain of those for us to put onto certain charts.
So it's fair to say they identified the evidence they wanted summarized.
Yes.
As part of that, for example, they gave you companies that they wanted you to focus on, right?
Yes.
Same with the bank accounts, they gave you those too, right?
Yes.
And they told you what kind of charts they wanted, right?
That's right.
And they instructed you to make changes to those charts, right?
Yes, additions, yes, adjustments.
Additions, subtractions, modifications, all kinds of changes, right?
Yes.
You also testified that you have been working in earnest on this project I think since the start of the year. Is that right?
That was the more intensive period, yes.
So even though Brattle has been retained for more than a year, it's true that the prosecutors were directing changes to your chart through last night, correct?
Yes.
I want to talk just a little bit about the process. So you testified I think on direct about the process that Brattle uses to analyze data, right?
A little bit, yes.
Not the entire process, but just a little bit, right?
Yes.
And that's, to use a colloquial term, maybe you scrub the data in different ways?
I wouldn't say that.
But part of the process is deciding what's relevant to the task, right?
Well, not for me.
That's going to be my next question. It's the government deciding what's relevant, right?
Yes.
And then they tell you, right?
Yes.
And then you go out and find it, right?
No.
So what do you do after the government tells you what they think is relevant?
I think the sequencing is a little different. They gave us the records. We told them what's in the record, and then they told us which of those records they wanted us to process. But they didn't know what was in the records until we processed them. So we were then to share the results with the government.
So it's a back and forth, fair to say.
Yes.
You told them, this is what's out there. They said, that's what we care about, right?
That's right.
And they never told you that they care about anything that was helpful to Mr. Guo, right?
I have no idea.
'Cause that's not part of your retention, right?
I'm sorry.
Withdrawn. Now, the prosecutors also reviewed your summary charts for accuracy, right?
I believe so.
Was that part of the changes that they made or proposed changes for accuracy, sir?
Not so much for accuracy. To ensure that all the transactions that they wanted included were actually included. And not those that should not be included.
Does Brattle do its own independent check for accuracy?
Yes.
Can you describe that process to us?
Well, there's many different checks. Obviously, when the database and the extraction is happening, individual team members are checking each other's work. But then ultimately what happens here is after the charts have been produced based on the transactions that the government wanted to be represented on the charts, we are able to identify every single source document associated with those transactions and then check the amounts against those source documents.
So let's take a look at one of those charts. Could we please pull up Government Exhibit Z26? Could we go to slide 4, please? So you testified about this on direct, correct, sir?
I did.
First, the sources of funds box. What sources go into that?
Well, sources of funds are identified as flows of funds from individual accounts where those individuals are not persons who have been identified as persons of interest or persons who are associated with any of the corporate agreements that we processed for the entities that are associated with the categories the government gave us. There was also in some charts I discussed on direct. You may recall that there were certain amounts that were flowing into G Club's Crane account that were in round amounts of 10,000. 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 where there wasn't actually the name of an individual indicated in the bank records, that information was blank. But in those specific instances, the government told us to also categorize those in inflows as sources of funds.
Got it. So with the exception of that last category that you talked about, the blind contracts, is it fair to say that the sources of fund process was a process of elimination?
I wouldn't say that.
Well, you eliminated persons of interest, right?
No. We started by identifying all the transactions in the accounts that the government told us to process and identified all the transactions of inflows from individuals.
And then you categorized those individuals, right?
Then we identified which, if any, of those individuals should not be included and excluded those.
And one of the groups of people who should not be included were persons of interest, right?
Yes.
Who decided what a person of interest was?
The government.
Can you give me an example of who some of the people are who are in the persons of interest category?
That would be the persons who were showing up in family members category or the defendant, for example.
And were there any other categories of people that you excluded?
Yes. As I said, there were persons who were identified as signatory or counterparties in service agreements and other contracts between the entities that were in the various categories that were in my summary charts.
And those are service agreements that were identified to you by the government?
Yes. One of the assignments the government gave us. Actually, our first assignment was to review various different types of agreements, including the farm loans that we discussed on my direct. There was a detailed list of those loans. Those were actually individual loan documents, and those were among some of the agreements that we processed.
So the farm loan documents that you testified about on direct, they were signed by the lenders, correct?
Yes.
But not the borrowers, right?
Yes.
Did you exclude the lenders from the sources of funds?
No, just the persons who were associated with the entities that are in each of these farms, GTV, Himalaya, etc., categories.
So there's further selection within the idea of the counterparties on the agreements, right?
Yes. So anybody who is a party to an agreement who's working for one of these entities or signing on behalf of one of these entities. Not a person who is providing sources of funds.
Did you discuss with the prosecutors why they focused on these particular sources of funds on slide 4?
No.
So you have no idea what the import of this slide is in term withdrawn. That's a bad question. I apologize. Let's just look at the VOG box on the left. You see that?
Yes.
The date range on that is from April 2020 to October 13, 2020, correct?
Yes.
Have you ever heard of the GTV private placement?
I think I've seen references to a private placement in the documents.
Could we pull up GXC 63T alongside this exhibit, please? So on the left is the translation of a June 2020 broadcast. Could we just blow up or highlight the line that starts? It's almost in the first bucket there. Can you just read that, Mr. Hinton?
It's almost 12 o'clock noon on June 2nd.
Can we go to page 7 and highlight the line when you get there, GTV is now? It's in the fourth box down. Can you read the part of that sentence that starts, GTV is?
GTV is now starting to be legal.
You would agree with me, sir, that June 2nd, 2020 is earlier than October 13th, 2020?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that if you expand the scope of the date range that you're looking in, that could include more money flows. Correct?
Yes.
We can take that down. Can we put up GXC 26 again, same slide? Let's look in the middle box. The one that says Soraka. You see that?
Yes.
What's the date range for that $286 million?
February 22nd, 2019 through July 3rd, 2020.
Could we just pull up alongside of GXBK 5, please, alongside it? Do you see a date on that document on the right?
April 20th, 2020.
And you would agree with me, sir, that April 20th, 2020 is more than a year after February 22nd, 2019?
I agree.
And again, if you expand that date range, it would increase the amount of money coming in, right?
Well, just to be clear, this date range represents the date range of all the transactions that we processed. So those we are just showing all the transactions that we processed. And yes, if there are more transactions from other accounts we didn't process, that number could go up.
Sure. And if you expanded the time period, the number could go up, right?
Perhaps. I don't know. I haven't processed those transactions.
So let's go to slide 5. Actually, let's go to slide 6. This is the VOG flow of funds, right?
Yes.
And you see the middle arrow there?
I do.
That's $17.3 million, right?
Yes.
And the date range there is March 12, 2018 through May 12, 2020, right?
Yes.
Again, that's more than 2 years from the private placement start date, correct?
Based on your representation of when that date was, yes.
Based on the document that I had, you read the April 20th date, right?
Yes.
And then, if we look to the box to the right of that, that goes to Voice of Gua Media, right? Do you see that?
Yes.
And that's $2 million.
I'm a little confused as to which arrow you're referring to.
So maybe can you help me out? The middle box there, the one for La Friends that has WFB 1005. You see that?
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong. It looks like there's an arrow going from that box to Voice of Gua Media with WFB 5536, right?
Yes.
And that arrow reflects a fund flow of $2 million over the period of time between July 11, 2019 and May 5, 2020, correct?
Yes.
And July 11, 2019 is several months before April 20, 2020, correct?
Yes.
Let's look at slide 15. Let's just start at the top left there. So you see all those, I think you call them dark blue boxes?
Yes.
Those are associated with G clubs, withdrawn. Those reflect bank accounts associated with G clubs operations, LLC, correct?
There's also another blue box for a different G Club entity.
So let's start with the ones at the top, the 4 at the top. Those are all G clubs operations, right?
Yes.
And the way that you're able to associate them with G clubs operations is because all of those accounts are in the name of G clubs operations. Right?
Yes.
And so the same is true with the other dark blue box that is in the name of G Club International Limited. Correct?
Yes, the Mercantile 0103 account is G Club International Limited.
Another way to represent what's going on at the top, instead of having 4 boxes. You could just have one representing G Club operations, correct?
Yes.
But the prosecutors asked you to have 4, right?
Yes.
Now, the same is true if we go over to the light blue boxes on right. Do you see those?
Yes.
Those are all for Crane Advisory, right?
That's correct.
And again, you were able to associate those with Crane Advisory because all of those accounts are in the name of Crane Advisory. Right?
That's right.
So you could have collapsed those 6 boxes into one, right?
In theory, yes.
But they didn't want you to do that, right?
They instructed us on the format of the chart.
So now let's look at the yellow boxes down at the bottom. Do you see those?
Yes.
Now, the yellow boxes down at the bottom. Almost all of them are associated with something called Hamilton, right?
Yes.
There's one that's not, that doesn't have the word Hamilton in the box, right?
Yes, there's a Himalaya International Clearing account.
Who told you to put that box in yellow?
The government.
So again, all of the Hamilton accounts, the ones that are actually labeled with Hamilton. You are able to associate those with Hamilton because they're all in Hamilton's name, right?
Yes, there's 5 Hamilton Opportunity Fund and 1 Hamilton Digital Assets.
Now I'm just going to pick one at random. The Crane Advisory account that receives $59.5 million between November 23, 2020 and April 1, 2021, you see that at the top.
Yes.
CIT is Citibank, right?
Yes.
Citibank is a U.S. bank, right?
Yes.
Almost all the banks represented on this slide are U.S. banks, right?
Most of them, that's right.
In fact, of the, I don't remember, the 600 bank accounts that you analyzed roughly. The hundreds of bank accounts that you analyzed roughly, almost all of them were U.S. bank accounts, right?
Well, there's Swiss accounts.
That wasn't my question. I asked you almost all of them.
The majority were U.S. bank accounts.
Just staying on this for a second, let's look at the top left. And I'd like to just circle the 52.2 million from G Club operations to G Club operations, that's at the top left box. Can we circle that 52.2, please? That's a transfer of $52.2 million on December 17, 2020 between two G Club's bank accounts, correct?
Yes.
And then let's circle the 14.5 below that. That reflects a $14.5 million transfer on January 11, 2021. Between G Club's bank accounts, correct?
Yes.
Now let's circle the $10 million one below that to Fiesta. And that represents a $10 million payment withdrawn. A $10 million transfer from G Club's operations account to Fiesta Property Developments, correct?
It's the aggregate amount of transfers between those periods from those accounts.
So those transfers started on January 21, 2021, right?
Yes.
And so those transfers started after the $52 million transfer and the $14.5 million transfer, right?
Yes.
So from this chart, how much of the $52.2 million and $14.5 million make up that $10 million?
I don't know.
You can't know, right?
Well, you could do some tracing analysis and come up with an estimate.
Right, but you testified on direct that you didn't do that, right?
That's correct.
So there's no way based on this chart to link those amounts to that $10 million, right?
They are linked to it on this chart.
Well, I understand that you put arrows there, but there's no way to say that this dollar is this dollar. Right?
Well, I disagree. The funds come in at an earlier point in time. And then funds leave at a later point in time, so that is a connection.
That is a connection between two dates, right?
Between flows of funds.
It's a chronology.
Yes.
We'll come back to that. Let's go to the Crane Advisory, the center bucket there. You see those? Let's start with the $58.2 million that goes from Citibank account 5278 down to that light blue box below it. The other Crane Advisory account. You see that one?
Yes.
Then there's an arrow going $6.8 million from that account to the Lowell Mitchell account. You see that?
Yes.
The date range of the $58 million transfer is January 22, 2021 through March 30, 2021, correct?
Yes.
And the transfer of the $6.8 million is October 19, 2021, right?
Yes.
So that's almost 7 months after the last transfer of the $58.2 million, correct?
Yes.
And I believe you testified on direct that this is select flows. So it doesn't represent all of the transactions, correct?
That's true.
It doesn't reflect any other money that went into that Crane Advisory Group box that received the $58.2 million. Right?
No.
Let's stay with this blown up for a second.
I disagree. I said no.
You said no to what? I'm sorry. What is it that you're disagreeing with?
With your prior question. I didn't affirm your question. I disagreed with it.
Okay. Tell me what you're disagreeing with.
You said there weren't any other flows coming into that account. There's another arrow coming into that account. I just want to be clear.
Understand. That's a fair point. All the potential other flows that are coming into that account. Right?
Correct.
Thank you for that. Let's look then at there is an arrow, the $58 million. The account that sends $58 million to the Crane Advisory account also sends $10.7 million to this Crane Advisory set of IDB bank accounts. Correct?
Correct.
And that is the last date of those transfers were May 28, 2021, right?
Yes.
And then there's another transfer from the IDB Crane accounts to Lowell Mitchell of $1.6 million. Correct?
Yes.
And that occurs on September 27, 2021, right?
Yes.
So that's almost 4 months after the last of those $10.7 million transfers, right?
Correct.
Let's now go to slide 27, please. Now this shows various flows of funds related to the Himalaya exchange. Right?
Yes.
So the first box sources of funds that represents the same sources of funds we were talking about before. Right?
Correct.
And then it shows about $470 million going from that gray box to a Himalaya International Clearing bank account. Right?
Yes.
And that's an account for the Himalaya exchange, you understand?
I have no independent understanding of what it's for.
So you don't know what company that's associated with?
Well, the chart says Himalaya Exchange, and these are the accounts that are designated. But the title of the account is Himalaya International Clearing, so I don't know what the role of that account is.
But the government told you that this was a Himalaya Exchange bank account?
To color it yellow so it's in that category. To say it's a Himalaya Exchange account that's just a classification for the purposes of these charts.
Fair enough. They gave you the paint by numbers, right?
Yes.
Now, the date range for that is June 2nd, 2021 through June 30th, 2022, right?
Yes.
Would you agree with me, sir, that November 2021 comes after June 2nd, 2021?
Yes.
Are you aware that the Himalaya Exchange first launched trading on November 20th, 2021?
No.
So let's go to slide 30, please. This is titled Yacht-Zoo Expenses, right?
Yes.
Now, there's a $3.9 million sum of all the inflows in the middle there, right?
Yes.
And that's supposed to represent all the money coming in from these other entities, right?
Yes.
So bank accounts, right?
Yes.
So you got the G Club International with 478,000 right, you got the HCHK, and then the 3 lamp bank accounts. Right?
Yes.
Now, the 478 from G Clubs that counts in the 3.9 million, you ever heard of a yacht called the Liberty before?
No.
And the date range listed under the 3.9 million, that's May 7th, 2020 through October 21st, 2022, right?
Yes.
Can you find for me on this chart a transfer that began on May 7th, 2020?
I think it's a typo. It looks like it starts on May 7th, 2021 if you look at the transfer on the left.
That's the Lamp Capital one, right?
Correct.
The prosecutors didn't ask you to include any transfers to Yacht-Zoo from 2020, right?
These are the flows they selected to present on the chart.
And they're all supposed to be from 2021, right?
I don't know what the criteria they used to select them.
I meant ignoring the typo, they're all supposed to be from 2021, right?
These all are between 2021 and October 2022.
And that's the date range that they gave you, right?
Well, they identified the transactions and these are the dates of the transactions.
Now, let's look at slide 8, I believe it is. This is the Farm Select flows, right?
Yes.
Now, you have no idea what farms means in the context of this case, right?
That's correct.
And there's $77 million that are reflected on this chart going to a company called ACA Capital, right?
Yes.
So first let's take a look at, there's a transfer from ACA Capital that goes to Savio Law for $32 million. Correct?
Yes.
That occurs between a period of November 12th and November 16th, 2020, correct?
Yes, correct.
And then your chart reflects an arrow going from Savio Law to leading shine of $3 million on August 20th, 2020, correct?
Correct.
So August 20th, 2020 is before November 12th, 2020, correct?
Yes.
So as a logical matter, the $3 million that went from Savio Law to leading shine could not have been part of the $32 million that went from ACA Capital. Correct?
I would agree.
So then let's look down to Lamp Capital, the one below it. Now that's a $5 million transfer from Savio Law to Lamp Capital, correct?
Yes.
And what's the date of that transfer?
That is October 15th, 2020.
You would similarly agree with me that October 15th, 2020 is before November 12th, 2020, correct?
Yes.
As a logical matter, that $5 million couldn't have come from that $32 million, correct?
That's correct.
And then there's also a $5 million transfer from Savio Law to Greenwich Land, correct?
Yes.
And what's the date of that?
October 15th, 2020.
Same thing, right? October 15th is before November 12th, 2020.
Correct.
So that money couldn't have come from the $32 million, correct?
That's correct.
But the prosecutor asked you to put these arrows this way anyway, right?
I don't know what you mean by anyway. These arrows reflect transactions that are represented accurately on the chart.
They represent transactions that happened, right?
Yes.
Now, there's another box all the way up in the top left. Do you see that?
Yes.
It says other inflows. You see that?
Yes.
What are other inflows?
Well, it's other sources of funds, other transfers into the ACA Capital account that aren't otherwise represented on this chart. So from sources other than farms.
You met with the prosecutors this past Saturday, correct?
Yes.
June 20th, right?
I believe that was the date.
And during that meeting you discussed this slide?
I don't remember which of the slides we discussed on Saturday versus Sunday versus Monday.
Now, prior to that meeting, there was a version of this slide that didn't have the other inflows on it. Correct?
Probably, yes.
And after your meeting, and you told the prosecutors that there were these other inflows, right?
I don't remember whether that was something I said.
So can you tell me the process by which the other inflows box got added to this slide?
Well, the prosecutors asked that we add it to the slide.
When did that happen?
I don't recall.
Now, do you remember or recall in reference of this issue Brattle using the phrase inflow/outflow violation?
Yes.
What's that mean?
It's just a balancing check that was conducted for certain of the needs on the chart.
Can you break that down for the jury a little bit?
Sure. Just that because these charts don't show all of the transactions. They are only showing the transactions that we processed and the transactions between the entities that were selected on the charts. It's possible that the amounts that are shown on the arrows, if you sum up all the arrows going into the account and going out, that the amount going out might be larger than the amount coming in. So that's just the balancing question or check that we were asked to sometime perform for some of these nodes.
So if the outflows exceed the inflows from a particular source, that means that there was money in the account outside of the specific source that you were looking at, correct?
Right. That either means that there was a pre-existing balance in the account before the time period where we had data, or there were other entities that had transferred money into the account that weren't being shown on the chart.
So one of the ways that the prosecutors try to address this violation was by sending you more entities that they could classify as farms. Right?
If you want to try to explain more of the inflows, you've got to identify what are those transactions and who are they with. So there were a couple of examples where there were changes made to the chart to give us more financial records so we could add those financial records to the chart.
Right. And the goal of that was to increase the inflows from the so-called farms, right?
In that particular case, yes. There were additional entities identified as farms while we were preparing the summary charts and looking at different iterations of those. The government decided to add additional entities to the farms classification.
And Brattle didn't do any kind of independent check to figure out if those were actually farms, right?
That's correct.
That all came from the government, right?
That's correct.
Even after that, were you able to solve the so-called violation?
It's nothing really to solve. It's just a balancing test to see whether or not the number of inflows. The amounts are greater than inflows are greater or less than the amounts that you're showing going out. That's all it is.
And is it fair to say that the fact that there's this other inflows box means that the farm inflows did not account for all of the money that came out of the ACA capital account?
That's right.
Now, there's no amount of money on this chart associated with those other inflows, right?
That's right.
So the chart doesn't tell the jury how large those inflows are, right?
That's right.
There's no dates associated with it, right?
That's right.
There's no date range, right?
That's right.
Ms. Murray said, asked and answered.
The court said, sustained.
So if you take that $19 million that goes from ACA capital to Lexington property, you see that?
Yes.
How much of that money comes from the other inflows versus the $77 million from the farms?
I haven't been asked to do that calculation.
So you don't know?
I don't know.
Same question with the $11.2 million that goes to William J.E. and Sing Ting Wang.
I don't know. I haven't been asked to do that calculation.
Let's go to Hudson Diamond, the $18 million that Ms. Murray asked you about. How about that one? How much of the $18 million comes from the $77 million?
I don't know.
Were you asked to look?
No.
All right. How about the $13 million that goes to Lamp Capital right next to it? How about that?
I don't know.
Were you asked to look?
I wasn't instructed to perform a tracing analysis.
So the $5 million that goes to Greenwich Land, same answer.
Same answer.
So even though there are arrows connecting the ACA capital box and those entities we just talked about and arrows connecting the farms and ACA capital, you don't actually know if any of that $77 million accounts for these transfers, right?
I haven't traced the funds through to their ultimate uses, that's correct.
In fact, I believe you testified on direct that there are bank accounts that Brattle hasn't even looked at, right?
That's correct.
The court said, it's time for our 11:30 break. Members of the jury, we will come back in a half an hour. Remember that you're not allowed to discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't permit anyone to discuss the case in your presence. Don't read, watch or listen to anything that has to do with this case.
The law clerk said, jury exiting.
Jury not present.
The court said, sir, you may step out of the courtroom. Don't discuss your testimony.
The witness said, I will not. Witness exited the courtroom.
The court said, you may be seated. Is there anything before we return at noon?
Ms. Murray said, one brief matter to raise, Your Honor. With respect to certain of Mr. Kumraju's questioning. In particular relating to the ACA capital account at First Abu Dhabi Bank. This is on slide 8 of the exhibit we were just looking at. Mr. Kumraju pursued a line of questioning about this category reflected on the summary chart that is listed as other inflows where there's no date range or dollar amount associated with that. As the court and Mr. Kumraju are both aware, the First Abu Dhabi Bank account records were a part of the government's collected evidence in this case. They were used in the course of the government's financial analysis over the period of several years. Ultimately, the court excluded those from being admitted because of the issues we had with the Arab Emirates not giving us the certification that we could use to introduce those into evidence. But they are very corroborative of the flows that are on this chart. The government, consistent with the court's order, stripped out any sourcing from any of those records. So we redid all of the financial analysis not tied to those records, but instead tied to counterparties' records. As a result, the numbers went down on the summary charts, and that's fine. That's been covered with Mr. Hinton on his direct. But this is not fully inclusive of all of the flow of funds we see. And again, that's because the government, consistent with the court's order, did not rely on those records. But for Mr. Kumraju to imply very strongly with the witness here that this other inflows category was suggested by the government in what he appears to be suggesting an apparent effort to manipulate the summary of the financial flows. Your Honor, we would submit that opens the door, and we can question Mr. Hinton on redirect whether he did receive First Abu Dhabi Bank account records from the government, and whether the transactions reflected therein are consistent with the information on these summary charts. And we can establish that he did not rely on those for purposes of the total amounts reflected on the charts. But we would like to acknowledge their existence as a way of explaining the purpose of this other inflows category now that the door has been opened by Mr. Kumraju.
The court said, "Well, how do you explain the absence?"
Ms. Murray said, "The absence of what, Your Honor?"
The court said, "References to that bank?"
Ms. Murray said, "Well, there are references to the bank because we have represented the transactions as they were established and sourced through the counterparties. So we have up slide 8 of Government Exhibit Z26. You can see the ACA Capital FAB account. That's the First Abu Dhabi Bank account, and I think Ms. Loftus is pulling that up. To the extent that there are transfers that are indicated here, we show, if we could zoom out, Ms. Loftus, and show more of the context there. To the extent there are transfers that are shown flowing out from that account. That's from the accounts that are referenced here, the government exhibit cited in the appendix to this chart. I think with respect to the absence, it could just be a question to Mr. Hinton. Did you review records from that account? Are they consistent with the information on this summary chart? Did you rely on those records in sourcing the information on this chart? Why not? Is it because the government asked you not to rely on these as source records? And we could leave it at that.
The court said, "Mr. Kumraju."
Mr. Kumraju said, "A couple of points, Your Honor. Number 1, Mr. Hinton is a summary witness. He can only summarize or speak to evidence that's admissible and admitted in the record. Your Honor has already decided that the First Abu Dhabi Bank account is not admissible. They chose to present a chart that tried to link those funds to these transfers without the necessary evidentiary link. I was entitled to point that out. They've been on notice of this issue since Your Honor decided. These charts all come after that. On top of that, Your Honor, the concept that they would say, well, you had these records. You reviewed them. They corroborate it. Would necessarily open the door to us being able to say, in fact. The court found that those records were not reliable enough to be entered into evidence in this case. And those records were hearsay, and that the government had failed to authenticate them. So I don't understand how the government can refer to evidence that's not been admitted at trial simply because I attacked their summary chart and the material that they had. He still, and I circle back to my original point, a summary witness by rule has to testify to evidence that is in. That has been admitted. And Your Honors already ruled on this issue. They didn't have to present this chart this way. That was their choice.
The court said, "Ms. Murray."
Ms. Murray said, "Your Honor, I think at this point what we're facing is Mr. Kumraju has created a Rule 403 problem. To the extent that the court doesn't want the government to explore this line of questioning with Mr. Hinton. I guess we understand that. It does seem like a strategy in play by the defense to exploit the court's ruling with respect to the ACA capital records in particular, which, as we indicated in the briefing leading up to trial, are extremely important records for the purposes of the flow of funds. We did summarize the flow of funds using other admissible exhibits from other accounts that we collected. But that's accurately reflected on these charts. However, to continue going down this line of questioning, knowing what the parties know and the court knows about those records and the status of those records risk prejudicing the jury and confusing the issues. At kind of the bottom, the government would ask that the court request that Mr. Kumraju move on from this line of questioning.
Mr. Kumraju said, "I'll just say this, Your Honor. It is very emphatically the defense's strategy to point out the lack of evidence in the government's case. To the extent they are concerned about that, that is our strategy. Here, we are pointing out the fact that they do not have admissible evidence to link these bank flows, which is directly responsive to their attempt to say that this money was misused on Mr. Gua's family. The fact that they were not able to authenticate that record does not create a 403 problem. And my ability to attack that is fundamental to presenting a defense. I've never heard of a case where undermining the government's evidence creates a 403 issue. And there's no prejudice to the jury, as Ms. Murray said. The jury can understand what's going on. They can make arguments about the tracing if they want. But the jury is the one who gets to decide that. They don't get to say, well, Mr. Kumraju shouldn't pursue questions that show a weakness in our case because we know about inadmissible records. I know about inadmissible information also that I would love to refer to in Mr. Gua's defense. But I can't do it because it's not admitted into evidence.
The court said, so I am not going to permit the government to go into these Abu Dhabi records.
Mr. Kumraju said, thank you, Your Honor.
The court said, that's it.
Recess.